Hello, hello. Okay, I think we're about ready to get going. Is that gonna, you guys can deal with that, right? That feedback? Okay. I was told counterintuitively to move the mic closer to me if we get feedback, so hopefully that situation will resolve itself. But thank you so much, everybody, for being here. It's 5:31 here, so I think I'm gonna go ahead and get going here in just a moment. I'm super glad you guys are here. It's really exciting that we're finally able to get together and do this. We tried, as many of you know, I guess, a few weeks ago, and we happened to have a fire in the building right at the same time, and so the event was canceled and rebooked for right now. And so I'm really glad you guys could make the effort to be here. If you haven't discovered already, Carrie Hutton, who I think she's still outside at the table, but she kind of behind the scenes helped organize a lot of this stuff, including ordering lots of good munchies. And so there's hot chocolate and I don't even know what all is out there. I saw brownies and cookies and a variety of other things. So I hope you're taking advantage of that. Speaking of that, I actually was curious, how many of you had hot chocolate? Anybody? A good few of you? How are you guys feeling? I shouldn't crack jokes like that. No, we did not spike the hot chocolate. But cocoa, at least I don't know about this cocoa, but real cocoa has anandamide in it, which interacts with your endocannabinoid system in much the same way that things like delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol interact. So, you know, when you drink hot cocoa, if it gives you a happy, blissful feeling, there may actually be a little bit of that anandamide that's contributing to that. And so I just thought I would mention that. So anyway, and if you haven't had some, you can help yourself. And feel free, this is very informal, so feel free to, if you have, if you need to use the restroom or get something to eat or drink or whatever, just do so. Oops, I got to stay in front of this. Sorry, I forgot about that. And yeah, please remind me if I wander away from this. I'm used to wandering around when I talk. I guess I should introduce myself. I'm Dr. Brian Barringer. I'm a professor here at UWSP. I happen to be the chair of the biology department right now as well. I'm in the middle of my 6th year of being chair. I'll be stepping down after this year and going back to being just sort of a regular professor on the street, if you will. And I became involved in growing and studying cannabis here on campus back in 2019. So basically right before COVID hit, which was an adventure in and of itself, as you all know. But that's when things started here on campus, and my research program and the research programs of several collaborators here at UWSP and elsewhere at Madison and other places more or less just kind of exploded overnight with lots of student interest. And so what I'm going to talk to you about today is kind of a little bit of everything. We're going to talk a little bit about what cannabis is and cannabis isn't, for that matter. We're going to talk quite a bit about the history of cannabis cultivation, not just here in the state of Wisconsin, but really worldwide. We're going to learn. We're going to think a little bit about that history, and then I'm going to end by just touching a little bit on, and frankly, along the way, I'll touch on some of this stuff. But I'll touch a little bit on some of the exciting research and teaching that's going on here at UWSP. We have a new cannabis science program that a number of faculty are involved in, for example. And so I'll touch on some of that stuff as I get to the end. I wanted to start out, by the way, with this. This is a quote from Carl Sagan, believe it or not. I hope most of you in the room know who Carl Sagan was. He's passed away now, but he was an astronomer and astrophysicist, and he wrote quite a bit about marijuana later in his life. He wrote under the pseudonym Mr. X, but we now know that it was Carl Sagan, and he wrote quite a bit about it. He talked a lot about how when he discovered, if you will, marijuana late in life, how it sort of fueled his creativity and helped him kind of think outside the box about a number of the complex things that he was struggling with. And so I just always love this quote because, there's no doubt, absolutely no doubt, that cannabis is one of the world's oldest domesticated plants. Whether or not you could sort of connect the dots and draw a line between, marijuana and the advent of agriculture and therefore civilization. Do I need it closer? Okay. Oh, yeah, thanks. That sounds complicated. Okay. Thank you. whether or not that's, I mean, that seems like a bit of a stretch, but I've still always really enjoyed the quote, and so I just thought I would share it with you. So as I said a moment ago, I'm essentially going to do three things today. I'm going to start out by talking about what cannabis is and what it isn't, for that matter. I'm going to then talk about a brief history of cannabis cultivation and use. I'll try to highlight some of the more interesting aspects of that history that pertain to the state of Wisconsin, but we'll also be talking pretty globally. And then we'll talk, as I said, about the future of cannabis science here at UWSP and beyond. Before I get into all of that, I try to be, or I'm often a little bit unorthodox when I give these kinds of talks, in that I like to start out by thanking a number of people, because there are an awful lot of people. I mean, I might be standing up here talking about this stuff, but there's a lot of people that I work with, both colleagues here at UWSP as well as at other institutions, and importantly, our students. They are a huge part of what we do and have been since the beginning. And so I like to start out by just highlighting some of those individuals. And so if we start up there on the upper left, that first person there on the left, his name is Sean Kim. And I like to talk about him because he was actually a UWSP student. And so he was my student doing research with me. And back in, I guess this would have been very early fall semester of 2019, Sean came to me and asked me if he could grow cannabis in the UWSP greenhouse. And I frankly thought he was joking, and I just said, yeah, Sean, that's going to go over really well. And he said, well, no, I'm serious. And he told me about the Farm Bill, which I'll talk about here in a moment. And long story short, I jumped through the hoops to do what I could to sort of entertain his interests. I ended up with a grower's license. Luckily, my dean and others were backing me with those pursuits, and away we went. And so really all of this started with Sean and a question from a UWSP student. And so it's just kind of neat how things will come full circle. Moving to the right there is Dr. Ann Impoletti. She's a plant physiologist and plant pathologist. She's leaning over some equipment there. You can't see them in frame. You see corn there behind her, but where I'm standing taking that photo is a huge field full of cannabis that we were doing some work on down at Arlington Research Station, which is owned by UW-Madison. There on the sort of second from the right is Dr. Shannon Reha in the blue, and her student Danielle. Shannon is a chemist and does a lot of the behind-the-scenes chemistry work for us. That's Bryant Scherenbrock there on the right. He's a soil scientist, the upper right, I should say. He's a soil scientist. Soil is perhaps obviously quite important when you're growing plants, whether cannabis or anything else for that matter, and so he's been an integral part of what we do. Down on the bottom left is Joe Mondlock, another chemist. Again, he's come on board, especially with some of our work recently on PFAS phytoremediation and using both cannabis and alfalfa to remove PFAS from polluted soil environments, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then Laura Cole helps us a little bit with some of our terpene and flavonoid and cannabinoid analyses that we do. That's Chung Soon there, second to the right, who's sitting back there somewhere. I saw him, there he is. And among many other things, he's a scanning electron microscope extraordinaire, and we're doing some really interesting work that involves microscopy and those kinds of approaches. And then last but not least on the right is Dr. Shelby Ellison. She's a collaborator down at UW-Madison who we work quite a bit with as well, and she heads up the hemp research program down there. And then just real quickly, a number of people behind the scenes in sort of the administrative half of this story, starting in the upper left, Carrie Hutton, who many of you met outside. She's the person that really organized a lot of this and took care of a lot of the details. My dean, Dr. Josh Hagan, who's sitting over there, has been a huge supporter of our research program from the beginning. And then on the right, Dr. Paul Whitaker, who's here somewhere, my assistant dean. Same deal, huge supporter. Jason Dacchioli, bottom left, another assistant dean, no longer, but was my assistant dean and a real champion for what we're doing. And then finally, Tanya Wada and Nick Schultz down there on the bottom, in the middle, and on the right. They help a lot with what we do behind the scenes as well. So again, I just wanted to highlight those individuals because so much of what we do is done by certainly people other than me, and I just want to make sure that I'm highlighting that. And then most importantly, our students. And so what you're seeing up here are just a number of photos that I have taken over the years of our students and some faculty that are involved in our research. In fact, there on the bottom right, that was a harvest that we just did out at Bryant Scherenbrock's place just a few weeks back. So certainly thank them. They are really the heart and soul of everything we do, and none of what we get done would get done without them, that's for sure. So. All right, so with that sort of long-winded preamble and getting that out of the way, I wanted to talk a little bit about, as I said, what is cannabis? I'm guessing, a lot of people in the room here know quite a bit about cannabis, and so let's talk about it. So first of all, cannabis, which is often referred to, as you probably know, as either hemp or marijuana, it refers to a relatively small genus, okay? A relatively small group of flowering plants in the family, the Cannabaceae. The family itself includes about 170 or so species. The majority of those are in a particular genus called Celtis. That is by far the largest and most speciose genus in the family. Cannabis and Humulus, hops, are another couple of genera that are in the family. They are relatively small compared to Celtis, but they are certainly much more economically important. Compared to Celtis. Cannabaceae, and I was talking to some folks earlier about this when they were coming up and looking at the plants up here, and by the way, I should have mentioned that I brought some plants for show and tell, and you're welcome to come check these out, and I can tell you what you're looking at there. There's a couple of different lineages that I'm happy to talk with you about, but as I was talking to folks about earlier, cannabis are generally dioecious, which is just a sort of a fancy biological word that refers to the fact that most individuals are either female or male, but not both, okay? So your typical cannabis plant, like this particular individual it's a lineage called Colorado cherry wine that's grown a lot for CBD production. This is a female, it's a feminized line, and so there are only female flowers on this plant. This plant, on the other hand, is called Badger 3. It was developed down the road at UW-Madison. They're working on developing some lineages that do well in our climate. And this individual is actually monoecious, which in the biological world is just a fancy word that refers to plants that have both male and female flowers on the same individual, right? So there's both male and female flowers on the same individual. The male flowers are not as conspicuous as the female flowers, but they're there. But most cannabis is dioecious, and I just wanted to sort of get that on the table. And they're primarily wind pollinated, and as a matter of fact, I recorded a video a number of years ago in the greenhouse here on campus. I had a bunch of feral hemp, and I'm going to talk a little bit about feral hemp here shortly, but these are plants that have been growing wild for, in most cases, 75 plus years. And I had a bunch of seed stock from those populations, and we brought them into the greenhouse. And as predicted, many of our plants were males, and many of our plants were females. And I did not want a bunch of seed ending up in my female flowers. We were doing some work with the flowers, and we wanted to prevent them from being pollinated. And so we sequestered the males and pulled the males away from the females so that we didn't have to worry about the females actually being pollinated. Again, they're wind pollinated, and even in the greenhouse with the fans and just air movement alone is all it takes to move this pollen around. And as a case in point, I thought it would be fun. I took a video of a bunch of male plants, and you'll see in the video, you won't see me, but you'll see the plants. And what I'm going to do is walk up to the plants and kind of shake them, and you'll just see the copious levels of pollen that fly off these plants. And I just thought it would be worth sharing that to give you an idea of how much pollen these guys are actually producing. See if this cooperates. Foreboding sound effects. So I'll shake this plant here in a second. Hopefully you can just kind of see all that yellow, that yellow dust. And I'll do it again, and then the camera will pan down, and you'll really be able to see it against the background as the camera pans down. You can kind of see it as the video comes to an end. there. So that just gives you some idea. I mean, these plants are wind pollinated, and plants in general that are wind pollinated, they have to produce a lot of pollen because wind pollination is not a very efficient mode of pollination. Most of the pollen ends up everywhere but where it should end up, right? Most of it ends up all over your windshield and all over the ground and every place but the stigmatic surface of a female flower. And so plants that are wind pollinated have to make up for that by producing copious amounts of pollen, and cannabis is no exception. They produce an awful lot of pollen. Speaking of that, some of the work that we've been doing lately, and this is just an example of where I'll just very, very quickly mention some of the research that we've been doing, but this is hot off the press, and Allie, I think you're here someplace. Where's Allie? I saw her earlier. Oh, there you are. Yeah, I'm embarrassing Allie. But Allie is down there on the bottom right. That's actually a photo I took of her up in Rhinelander because we were planting some plants up at the research station up there, I guess, at the beginning of this last summer. But Allie is also working with Dr. Soon on looking at doing some SEM, some scanning electron microscopy work. These are pollen grains. And so I just wanted to show you this slide since we just looked at pollen. These are individual pollen grains that Allie was able to visualize. And I think this is at, what, 1,600 times? Is that right? Am I reading this correctly, Chung? Yeah, yeah. So these are 1,600 times magnification, right? 1,600 times real size. And I just think they're neat. It's just kind of neat to look at these little pollen grains. And there's a lot of them. Speaking of scanning electron microscopy, by the way, another feature of cannabis that people are interested in for perhaps obvious reasons are what are called trichomes, which for those of you that aren't familiar with botanical terms, that just refers to hair-like projections, I guess I would call them, from epidermal cells. They can occur on any plant parts. In cannabis, you have what are called non-glandular trichomes that do not secrete substances, and you find those all over the plant, just like you do on many plants. You'll find them on leaves and stems, etc. But you also on cannabis have a large number of glandular trichomes, and that's what you can see there on the right. These are images taken by a UWSP student just, I think, earlier this year. Mary, who's since graduated, took these images of, again, both glandular and non-glandular trichomes. The glandular trichomes are the ones, they're the powerhouses, essentially, of cannabinoids, among other things. So they're the trichomes that are producing things like tetrahydrocannabinol, delta-9 THC, the main psychoactive component of marijuana, as well as a number of other really important compounds as well. Okay, but back to just, again, a little bit of a kind of a tutorial on what cannabis is. Most taxonomists at this point, I think it's fair to say, would agree that there are 3 species of cannabis, that there are 3 species that are delineated and that we differentiate among within the genus. But that hasn't always been the case. And so just like a lot of groups, people have argued over this and still argue over it a little bit. Carl Linnaeus, perhaps not surprisingly, those of you that know your history, your biological and ecological history in particular, Carl Linnaeus, not surprisingly, in the 1700s, he was the first person to formally describe and classify the genus as we understand it now. He grouped all variations, though, of cannabis into one species. He called it Cannabis sativa. There's an L after it now that just gives designation to him. A little bit later, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck comes along. He also spent a great deal of time thinking about taxonomy and systematics and so on. And so in 1785, he proposed that cannabis was a genus consisting of 2 distinct species, and in doing so, what he was doing was differentiating between what he thought, or what he argued, was the non-intoxicating form, what he called Cannabis sativa, from what he called Cannabis indica, which he felt was the intoxicating form. So we're moving the needle in the right direction at this point. We've now got a couple of species that people are differentiating between. And then a little bit later along comes the Irish physician William, and I always struggle with this guy's name, O'Shaughnessy. Somebody will have to help me if I'm saying that wrong. But he was known for introducing cannabis to Western medicine. Okay, he treated cannabis as a single species, but he did use the term indica to refer to the highly intoxicating version of the herb, if you will. So he did recognize that there was variation and that not all individuals are intoxicating. In 1924, early 1900s, the Russian botanist Dmitry Janisevsky, he identified and or described a third species, Cannabis ruderalis. And then a little bit later in the 1970s, another botanist essentially affirmed that and sort of in print basically said that he agreed with that designation, that there are 3 species. And that's pretty much where we are today, is those 3 species, Cannabis sativa, Cannabis indica, and Cannabis ruderalis. Now that said, as many of you probably know, there are thousands of different cultivars that people have developed over the years. And in this context, when I talk about a cultivar, I'm just referring to a variety of cannabis that's been cultivated or bred, if you will, crossed with or between lineages to exhibit specific desirable traits that people are looking for. Many of these crosses represent a two-way cross between something like sativa and indica. Oftentimes they include three-way or back crosses as well. Much of the time when people talk about so-called hybrid crosses of cannabis, at least in my experience, what they usually mean is a hybrid between Cannabis sativa and Cannabis indica. So that's, by far the most common cross. And the logic behind it is, despite what folks talked about, centuries ago, we now know that, depending on what particular version of Cannabis sativa you're thinking about, Cannabis sativa can be plenty intoxicating, right? It's not just Cannabis indica that's intoxicating, but also Cannabis sativa. And people have recognized that these lineages often have certain traits when it comes to their intoxicating effects, among other things, that might be desirable in a particular scenario. And so, for example, this is obviously a somewhat superficial kind of way of categorizing things, but perhaps you want to not only laugh uncontrollably, but you also want to relieve pain. And so maybe that's why you want, supposedly a hybrid between indica and sativa. And so there's a real science to this. I mean, people really get into this in terms of developing lineages that represent a mix of traits that they find desirable. The other player in this is Cannabis ruderalis. I mentioned that earlier, and sometimes folks will breed traits from Cannabis ruderalis into their hybrids as well. And one of the reasons for that is ruderalis is auto-flowering. And what I mean by that is that most cannabis is photoperiod sensitive. It will not produce its flowers until it detects that the day length is growing shorter. It's just an evolutionary response to living in variable, in areas that the day length changes over time. But ruderalis is not that way. It will flower no matter what. And for folks that are growing cannabis, particularly if they're interested in growing marijuana, the flowers perhaps obviously are what they're focused on, and so they want to make sure that they're producing flowers no matter what. And so oftentimes we find that modern day crosses have ruderalis genes, essentially, that have been bred into them specifically for that auto-flowering trait. One of the challenges that I encountered right away in studying cannabis and working with cannabis is, and it kind of sounds funny to say it this way, but there's so much information out there that for somebody like me back in 2019, coming at this from a relatively sort of naive standpoint and having a lot to learn, I was quickly overwhelmed. And to add insult to injury, what I have found as I have actually learned things is that much of the information that's out there is anecdotal at best and just plain wrong at worst. And I don't mean to pick on the Montana State Department of Public Health and Human Services, but this is a case in point. And in fact, every time I look at this document, the document there on the right, which apparently the Montana State Department of Public Health and Human Services puts out, every time I look at it, I find something else that's wrong on it. I mean, there's just all kinds of things on this document that's wrong. And it doesn't surprise me because there's just so much misinformation out there. And I talk to people all the time who They more or less think they know, what marijuana is, for example, but it turns out they really don't. Or they think they know what hemp is, and it turns out they really don't. And so I wanted to talk about that just for a moment. Again, sort of in the spirit of thinking about what cannabis is and what it isn't. First of all, let me just make it very clear that hemp and marijuana are common names, okay? They're not taxonomic or phylogenetic designations, okay? So they're exactly the same thing. The only difference between hemp and marijuana, at least legally, the only difference is the amount of a very specific version of tetrahydrocannabinol. It's called delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, okay, and that's different than, let's say, THCA, okay, which is the acidic form of tetrahydrocannabinol. But delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, that's the main psychoactive component of what we call marijuana, and legally speaking, if you have greater than 0.3%, I believe that's by weight, by dry weight, greater than 0.3% of delta-9 THC, you are marijuana. If you don't, if you have less than that, you are hemp. It's just that simple, okay? So for example, just to be clear, one of the things for some reason I see a lot, if you look down here, right there it says, or no, where was that? Hemp is produced from the male cannabis plant. No, that's not true. Okay, so, again, I see that sort of thing a lot. For some reason, people seem to think that hemp is male and marijuana is female, but that's not how it works, right? That's absolutely not how it works. So again, hemp and marijuana are not taxonomic designations. They don't refer to males versus females. It just refers to the amount of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, period. Which, by the way, somebody was asking me before the talk here, and I won't pretend to be an expert on this, but they were asking about what I call the THCA loophole here in Wisconsin. This is why you're able to go right down the street to some place like Alleviate Wellness or any number of other smoke shops or other places around here and essentially buy marijuana. They don't call it marijuana, they call it hemp, right? They call it THCA flower, but it's marijuana, okay? It's just not legally marijuana. And the reason it's not legally marijuana is because it has really high levels of THCA and really low levels of delta-9. But guess what? As soon as you heat it up, like smoke it, for example, all of that THCA decarboxylates and turns into delta-9 the same exact way it does in marijuana, and it gets you just as intoxicated as marijuana would, right? So that's the so-called THCA loophole. And because of those loopholes and because of those nuances, it's important that people, or at least people that care about this stuff, are educated and actually know, what these nuances are. All right, so as I said, that's the only distinction, the amount of delta-9. Both hemp and marijuana can have very high levels of cannabinoids, things like CBD, for example, and other cannabinoids, terpenes, flavonoids, right? The only difference is that delta-9. And of course, what that implies or what that means is that here in Wisconsin, hemp is legal to grow and process, at least with a license from the USDA, which I have. Marijuana is not yet. Or at least I think it's a matter of time, and not if, but rather when. But right now, marijuana is not. Okay, so with all of that behind us, I wanted to talk a little bit about the history of cannabis cultivation and use. Essentially, what this is going to be is really, again, a tour of this history and thinking about how cannabis is sort of enjoyed worldwide domination because of human activity. And that's really, I don't think, hyperbole. I mean, I really think it's true. I mean, there's very few other plants that people, go out of their way to build entire rooms in their basements and garages to grow, right? I mean, so cannabis has certainly benefited evolutionarily from its relationships, from its relationship with humans. As I said earlier, it's absolutely one of the world's oldest domesticated plants. It's native to Central and or South Asia, but as I just said, it's enjoyed worldwide expansion thanks to human activity. The earliest written account of people using cannabis, in this particular case medicinally, comes from Shun Noom's Pharmacopoeia at about 2800 BCE. So what is that, about 5,000 years ago, give or take? But we know that humans were using cannabis long before that. We've got evidence that goes back to at least 8800 BCE, so 10,000 years plus. And so really, again, the evidence goes all the way back to, it is true, the dawn of agriculture, and may have certainly played a role in why and how people settled down the way that they did. Okay, so that's kind of the early beginnings of cannabis. From there, it slowly but surely spread to Europe from Asia over the course of several thousand years BCE. In 440 BCE, the Greek historian Herodotus wrote that the nomadic Scythians made tents and heated rocks to inhale hemp vapors that made them, quote, shout for joy. So it seems clear that something was going on there that we might think of as recreational use, or maybe involved in some sort of tradition, religious or otherwise. Such traditions like that slowly made their way to the Middle East during the Middle Ages, and it was during that period that cannabis became widely used, again, particularly in the Middle East, in the form of what we call hashish, which is just a concentrated resinous form of cannabis. Here in North America, things didn't get going until, as you can imagine, Europeans showed up. There's some evidence that in the 1500s, in the early 1500s, the Spanish were growing hemp in what is now Chile, in South America. But here in North America, there's really no evidence that anyone was using cannabis for anything until the Europeans showed up. And then starting in the 16 and 1700s, they went crazy. They started growing cannabis mostly as a fiber crop, growing hemp as a fiber crop. People weren't really using it recreationally, at least in North America back then. I mean, it was a very normal thing to grow for fiber, but that's about it. In fact, in 1794, George Washington declared that, quote, hemp should be grown as a key agricultural crop at any given opportunity in the U.S. It was encouraged for the production of all kinds of textiles and rope. There's no doubt that hemp fibers are one of the strongest natural fibers in the world, and it makes incredibly strong rope that's resistant to rot, etc. They make all kinds of things out of hemp, and they were at the time sails, clothing, etc. In fact, it was so important that you could use hemp as legal tender, all the way up into the early 1800s in some areas, particularly in the eastern United States. So it was quite an important crop. Domestic production flourished here in the U.S. Until about after the Civil War is when things started to slow down, and that was mostly because imports and other domestic materials were slowly but surely replacing hemp over time. At the same time, though, people were starting to use cannabis products more and more medicinally. And so, as I say here on the bottom of the slide, by the late 19th century, this was slowly, by the way, replaced with opioids as opium became more and more popular. But in the late 1800s, people were using cannabis and cannabis extracts to do all kinds of things, including treating pain. And I can't imagine the poor infant that would be subjected to that infant's relief, which I was curious, and people in this room may know more than I do, but apparently it's got cannabis indica extract in it. Then it's got sweet spirits of niter, which I don't know, somebody in here probably knows what that is, but apparently I read about, since then it's been shown to not only be ineffective, but it actually kills infants. And then of course you got to round everything off with chloroform there, as though those things aren't enough. So it's quite amazing, the things you could just buy over the counter at the time. And speaking of that, it didn't take long for people to realize, well, maybe we got to start regulating some of this stuff somehow. And so 1906, we see the passage of what is called the Pure Food and Drug Act. And really, this represents the beginning of any kind of federal regulation of drugs here in the U.S. It led eventually to the creation of the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, and at a minimum, it required labeling of any cannabis related or any cannabis found in any over-the-counter remedies, essentially. Fast forward just a little bit to around 1900, and in particular 1910. So 1910 was the Mexican Revolution, and right after the Mexican Revolution, Mexican immigrants were flooding into our country. Okay, so all kinds of Mexican immigrants were coming in, and they did use what we call marijuana recreationally, more so than many people were at the time in the United States. So they were sort of associated. They weren't the only group, but they were one of the groups that was associated with introducing, essentially, the recreational use of marijuana to society. And as you can imagine, that didn't necessarily go over well. We see lots of propaganda around that time. We still see lots of propaganda, obviously, but I tried to find some of the more intriguing pieces. I really kind of got a morbid kick out of this one. It says, deadly marijuana rolled in cigarettes becomes the curse of the Southern Republic and may account for the, quote, bravery of greaser bandits, whatever they are, who defy the United States, the insanity of Queen Carlotta, and is accounted for in the familiar historical legend of the poisoned tea. And so, yeah, we see lots of stuff like this at the time, lots of propaganda, essentially this sort of mounting resistance against, as I say here, the encroaching marijuana menace. And lots of people claiming that crimes were associated with the increased use of cannabis and so on. The same sort of thing happened on repeat during the Great Depression. And so during the Great Depression, you're talking a few decades later, massive unemployment, right? Massive unemployment rates. They're increasing public resentment and fear of immigrants. All that stuff had started decades earlier, and it was just getting worse and worse. That instigated, as I sort of hinted at earlier, a flurry of research that, surprise, surprise, ended up linking all kinds of crimes and insanity and violence and et cetera with cannabis use. So it didn't take very long. By 1931, 29 states here in the US had outlawed marijuana. So people reacted pretty quickly to this. And then speaking of that, it was around that time, so 1930, when the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, the FBN, was founded, and Henry Anslinger, who would really be hard to sort of exaggerate this guy's influence on the drug laws in our country, on prohibition. He was a real hard case, to put it mildly. He was an incredibly controversial figure, and he spearheaded a lot of this stuff that I'm about to talk about, really for the next few decades because of his influence. And so he was the first commissioner in that post, remained in that post rather until 1962. He was a huge supporter, as I just said, of prohibition, the criminalization of all drugs, and also, as I just said, he was a real controversial figure. He focused on demonizing racial and immigrant groups. He targeted jazz musicians as well, and so really it was because of Anslinger that African Americans also became sort of associated, particularly in jazz culture, became associated with marijuana. And so again, it was just sort of lumping all of those people into one group essentially, and then correlating negativity with the use of cannabis. Also around that time, famously, and in fact, you can still find this movie. I saw it just the other day on YouTube. You can watch the whole movie in its entirety on YouTube if you really want to. Reefer Madness. So 1936, this propaganda film, Reefer Madness, came out, was produced by a French director, which makes a lot of sense, by the way, because by then, by the early 1930s, the Motion Pictures Association of America, rather, had banned all showing of narcotics in movies. That went on for another 3 decades or so, until the 1960s. But this was a French movie, so they could get away with that. So that came out in 36, huge propaganda movie. It's actually kind of if you want to watch it sometime. And then the FBN, under the leadership of Anslinger, began a very aggressive anti-marijuana campaign that, as I said earlier, just ended up lasting for decades. Fast forward just a little bit to 1937, and this is going to be our first taste of Wisconsin here. 1937, Congress passed the Marijuana Tax Act. Surprisingly, or maybe not, it was drafted by Harry Anslinger. And the statute, it was still legal to grow marijuana, but you had to now be licensed. You had to pay an awful lot of taxes to do it. Essentially what they were doing, what Anslinger was doing, was taxing farmers out of business. They were making it so expensive for farmers to farm hemp or any cannabis that they wouldn't. And of course, that was the goal behind the scenes. This is actually a marijuana stamp that was apparently purchased by somebody here in Wisconsin back in July of 1945. And so people here in our state were still growing cannabis at this time, but again, there was sort of this growing taboo around it. It was becoming more and more expensive. And of course, the same thing, I would argue, is happening, now in some markets. If you look at places like California, where I don't think anybody would argue there's so much regulation and so much tax that it's not surprising that 75% of the cannabis that's sold in places like California is still in the illicit market. It's still grown in the black market. It's just way too expensive for many people to go through the legal channels, and so they don't. And so it's an unfortunate situation in that regard. But so 1937, we've got the Marijuana Tax Act. Again, as I mentioned earlier, this is kind of our first look at Wisconsin, but I'm going to backpedal just a little bit because folks here in Wisconsin they started growing cannabis back in the very early 1900s. And so the oldest records that I've found were right around 1910 or so. There was a bulletin put out by the UW-Madison Agricultural Extension Office on some of the best sort of methods to grow hemp in our region. And so, even by, 1911, when this photo was taken, I mean, there were plenty of people here in our state growing cannabis, and that went on for some time. Again, this is a field of hemp that's been chalked, and so it's ready essentially for processing down in Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. This photo was taken in 1930. That's actually a hemp mill, a well-known hemp mill that's there in the background. And so again, folks were growing hemp here, absolutely. This was one of the largest, the Fairwater Hemp Company was one of the largest hemp processing organizations in the United States until they went out of business. They eventually shut down in 1931, and again, it was because of this growing taboo, and so fewer and fewer people were farming hemp, and so these hemp mills, even these big ones, were slowly but surely going out of business. In some ways, the story of cannabis, not just here in our state, but really our country, is interesting in that it's really a story of ebb and flow and push and pull and back and forth. And I think you'll see that by the time I'm done here, because even now with Anslinger and growing taboos, even at that point in the 1940s, there was this huge resurgence of growing hemp in particular in our country. In fact, it was marketed under the Hemp for Victory campaign. I don't know how many of you have heard of a so-called victory garden, right? You probably didn't think of marijuana growing in a person's victory garden, but during World War II in particular, again, you can make an awful lot of really useful stuff out of hemp fiber. And hemp fiber was really important to the U.S. military, among other groups. Groups like the Navy, for example, use one hell of a lot of rope, and they prefer to use hemp-based rope because, again, it's rot resistant, it's extremely strong, etc. But because of World War II, supply chains were disrupted, and so our government basically tried to solve that problem by telling U.S. farmers, hey, we'll not only give you a draft deferment to stay at home and grow hemp, we'll actually supply you with seed. And so that's what happened during the 1940s, during World War II. In particular, the U.S. government was, again, pushing back the other way and trying to increase at least hemp production in the U.S. by giving folks draft deferments and giving them the seed, et cetera, to stay home and grow hemp. And speaking of that, again, this is just a little snippet that's kind of related to some of our research. One of the things that I became interested in particular in working with Shelby Ellison at Madison, I introduced you to her earlier. She runs their cannabis research program down there, and she's been quite interested in the feral hemp populations that are located all over our state and really all over the Midwest. And the reason that they're there is because so much hemp used to be grown in our region. And you can imagine, as an analogy, you can imagine that if corn farmers in our state stopped growing corn tomorrow, you'd come back in 50 years and you'd still find corn all over the damn place, right? Because it would be growing feral. There's so much of it in our state that even if people weren't actively growing it, it would surely persist. And that's exactly what's happened with cannabis. And so many of you probably have heard the phrase ditchweed, for example. And it's called that because you'll find it growing in ditches next to some farmer's field, with a bunch of corn, and then there'll be 20 cannabis plants growing there in the roadside ditch. And so Shelby Ellison at Madison in particular, but I've helped with this a little bit, and a number of other people have been working very hard to collect seed stock from as many feral hemp populations as we can. And there have been a number of research questions that we've pursued using those populations. And this map is just meant to give you some idea of the distribution of those populations. It's just a quick and dirty map that I created using our data, some of our data a couple of years ago. And so you can see on the left is the state of Wisconsin. On the right is a broader view at the Midwest. And then all the green dots are just locations of feral hemp populations that we've confirmed. And so it's all over the place. I mean, and it's no surprise because people were growing it all over the place. All right, so back to this history. And so all of this is going on, through World War II. People are, if anything, there's this sort of resurgence of growing hemp in particular in our country. 1944, the then mayor of New York City, LaGuardia, commissioned a report, essentially, on the supposed dangers of cannabis use, et cetera. And in fact, the report contradicted claims that smoking marijuana results in things like insanity and deteriorates physical and mental health, et cetera. So it was essentially sort of pushing back. This report ended up more or less pushing back, again, against some of the taboos that had grown over the previous decades. But that didn't stop people much. I mean, through the 1950s, we still saw some pretty conservative laws passed, things like the Boggs Act in 1951, the Narcotics Control Act in 1956. Basically, these were setting minimum sentences for, and fairly harsh ones, I would say, for being caught with marijuana. So, for example, a first offense marijuana possession carried a minimum sentence of 2 to 10 years with a fine of up to $20,000, which was an awful lot of money at the time, right? Still a decent amount of money. So again, pushing and pulling, ebbing and flowing, right? Enter the 1960s, particularly the mid to late 1960s, and our country starts to see a little bit of a change in terms of how people are thinking about cannabis. We see a changing political and cultural climate. And a lot of that, frankly, I think it's fair to say, was due to cannabis becoming more and more used by white middle-class people in our country, essentially. And it was becoming harder and harder to look people in the eye and make the claim that, marijuana was just associated with people with brown skin, basically, is what it came down to, right? And then on top of that, reports that were commissioned by Presidents Kennedy and Johnson found that marijuana did not induce violence nor lead to use of heavier drugs. And people at that time, you start to notice people talking about treatment rather than just heavy penalties, essentially. So having a more balanced conversation about it. On the other hand, 1968, we see the creation of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics and Dangerous Drugs. I'm glad we don't call it that anymore. It's a long acronym. That was a merger of FBN, which I talked about earlier, and a particular Bureau of Dangerous Drugs of the Food and Drug Administration, okay? And then in 1973, we see the creation of the DEA. So that's when the Drug Enforcement Administration came on board. That was a merger in turn of that long acronym up there, FBNDD, and the Office of Drug Abuse Law Enforcement. So that was 1973, and then if we back up just a couple of years, we get this, I was going to say famous, infamous, however you want to think about it, the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. Okay, so that was the act that unambiguously made all forms of cannabis illegal in the United States, period. Okay, so we often refer to it as the Controlled Substances Act. That's actually just a particular title. It's Title II of this larger act. But as you probably know, and as I indicate here, that act, you know, basically enacted very tight constraints over pharmaceutical companies in terms of how they were labeling and managing drugs, maintaining high security, et cetera. Controlled substances, according to that act, were divided into 5 schedules on the basis of things like their accepted medical use, their potential for abuse, et cetera. And cannabis, as crazy as it is for me at least to think about, was included in Schedule 1. Okay, so substances in Schedule 1 have a high potential for abuse, no accredited medical use, and a lack of accepted safety. And so, you know, other things in Schedule 1 are things like heroin, for example. Fast forward another couple years, 1972, we see the Schaefer Commission. Okay, this was a bipartisan commission that was appointed by President Nixon at the direction of Congress. And as I say here, they considered laws regarding marijuana and determined that personal use of marijuana should actually be decriminalized. Okay, so this was 1972. This is a fairly substantial study where they came out and just made that statement. Nixon ignored it, basically rejected the recommendation, but over the course of the 1970s, 11 states ended up decriminalizing marijuana, and most others reduced penalties. And so we start to see the first kind of examples of, even though things are still illegal at the federal level, local and even larger than local municipalities are decriminalizing things, just like they've been done here in Stevens Point, for example. 1974, again, you know, cannabis is becoming more and more sort of part of mainstream culture. There are larger and larger groups that are using cannabis. It's becoming more normalized. And in 1974, we see the founding of High Times magazine, which is, you know, as I say here, an American monthly magazine. I don't know if anybody in this room would have noticed, but after all these years, I guess they had some legal or some financial problems and stopped producing for about a year, but now they're back to it apparently. So, so other than that little blip, they've been publishing regularly since 1974, and lots of things that you'll find in that magazine. I mean, the sort of backdrop is the marijuana culture, but you'll find, you know, that they touch on lots of things, particularly, you know, counterculture kinds of ideas. 1976, we start to see the beginning of sort of the grassroots parents' movements, if you will, against drugs very broadly and marijuana in particular. We start to see that happening more and more. Some of those groups became quite influential with the support of the DEA, were essentially quite effective at steering public feeling and discourse, and their influence helped form the foundation of the 1980s so-called war on drugs, including Nancy Reagan's Just Say No campaign. I'm sure plenty of people in this room remember that really well. Speaking of the Reagans, so President Reagan in 1986 signed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, and in that act, there were, again, mandatory sentences for drug-related crimes. That new law raised federal penalties for marijuana possession and dealing, and they based those penalties on the amount of the drug that was involved. And then a later amendment to that ended up leading to the so-called 3 strikes you're out, the 3 strikes you're out policy that invoked or imposed even stiffer penalties and potentially provided for the death penalty for drug kingpins. 1989, this sort of thing continues. Bush declares a new war on drugs. Again, I remember this well. I'm guessing some of you in this room do. I remember watching him hold up his seized bag of cocaine there and announcing, you know, that this new war on drugs was the most important thing ever. He ended up, sort of allocating a large amount of funding to equip local and state police with literally military-grade equipment to deal with what he felt was the growing drug problem. Fast forward a little bit to 1996, and we see the first the first situation where in California where medical marijuana is legalized. And so that was the year that California voters passed Proposition 215, and that allowed for the medical use of marijuana for patients with things like AIDS and cancer and other serious and painful diseases. Of course, marijuana was still very much and is still very much illegal at the federal level. I was in California at the time. I was born and raised in Northern California. I remember when this happened in the 90s and hearing about it. I mostly would hear about it in the San Francisco area, dispensaries down there, and you would hear about them getting raided occasionally because even though they were legal at the state level, that nothing stops the DEA from coming in and raiding. And so as you can imagine, that was quite a contentious situation for a long time. But several other states did eventually come on board. And by the late 90s, we had states like Alaska and Washington and Oregon and Maine that now allowed, at least at the state level, for medical marijuana. Again, though, it's always been this complicated situation where the federal laws contradict, the state and local laws. So speaking of that, we're getting a little bit closer to where we are now. 2012, recreational marijuana was legalized for the first time, at least in recent history, in Colorado and Washington. They became the first states to legalize the recreational use. Since then, many other states have followed suit. And I try to keep up on this, but I feel like the landscape of this changes almost monthly. And I really, that's not an exaggeration. But as far as I know, as of right now, as of October 2025, there are 40 states plus Washington, D.C., that have legalized medical cannabis, medical marijuana, and 23 states plus D.C. have also allow recreational use. And at this point, as many of you know, here in Wisconsin, we're kind of an island of illegality surrounded by an ocean of legal marijuana. And again, I'm guessing that will change. It's just a matter of when. All right, 2018. So this is the farm bill that my student Sean Kim knew all about, and I didn't know anything about it at the time, but this is why he came to me and was so excited that we were going to be able to grow cannabis up in the greenhouse. And so what this farm bill did was, with mounting pressure and recognizing that hemp, not marijuana, but hemp, is a really important crop and can be used for all kinds of different things. Mounting pressure to sort of legalize hemp was growing, and there were a number of states in 2018 that took part in what is referred to as a hemp pilot program or a cannabis pilot program, and Wisconsin was one of those. And so back in 2019, I was able to apply for and I eventually received my license from the state to grow and conduct research on hemp here on campus. And then a year later, that process or whatever moved over to the USDA. And so my license is now through the USDA. But either way, we can now legally grow and conduct research on hemp here on campus, which is awfully nice. We still can't grow marijuana, but we can grow hemp. And so speaking of that, as I hinted at earlier, starting in 2019 for me, our research programs really just took off. I mean, it was quite clear that students were really interested in this. This was a slide that I put together just a couple of years ago, just as kind of a case in point. I started here in 2013, and starting in fall of 2014 was when I ended up with my first research students. And as you can see, from semester to semester, I had, usually about 2 to 4 students in my lab working on research projects of one flavor or another. And then in fall of 19, I started conducting research on cannabis, and you can see what happened after that. There was a little blip in fall of 20 when everything was pretty much online, and Hardly anyone was here on campus. Even then, we were growing cannabis here on campus. So my student Sean, who I introduced you to earlier, who has since, by the way, gone on to Madison and completed a master's degree in cannabis science down there, working with Shelby Ellison. He was working with me back then, growing plants in the greenhouse during COVID. But yeah, so students are really interested in this stuff. It was really, hard not to notice that lots and lots of people wanted to get involved in our work. And I don't blame them. I mean, there's no doubt, despite the complexity of the legal landscape of cannabis cultivation, this figure here just gives you some insight into what the industry has been doing over the last so many years. And so you can see this starts in 2017 and goes up to 24 or so. And it's been pretty much, it's leveled off the last couple of years, but other than that, it's been pretty much a story of growth. And that's on a national level. So lots and lots of jobs out there. And this, I should emphasize this once again. The data here that you're seeing are representative of the legal cannabis industry. And studies suggest that still about 75% of the cannabis grown in our country is grown in the so-called illicit market, right? So the illegal market. And so whenever we talk about these numbers, this represents, about 25% of the total sort of industry, if you will, surrounding cannabis. This is just a similar kind of thing, but looking at sales of legal cannabis and cannabis-based products in the U.S., again, growing significantly year after year. And it's interesting, I don't have the data on here, so I guess you'll just have to take my word for it, but if you take into account that this is, if you're willing to assume that this is only about 25% of the market, which most studies suggest that it's about that, 25%, then what that means is that there's actually American consumers are spending as much money per year on cannabis and cannabis-related products as they are on things like beer and wine. In fact, even more than on beer or wine. And so it's a huge industry. It's absolutely a huge industry, and it's growing. It's continuing to grow nationally. Here's just some data that kind of get at that a little bit. Not surprisingly, California has the largest market. California has the most people by far. But other states, several other states, including some of our neighbors, are quickly catching up. States like Minnesota that just recently legalized recreational marijuana, for example, the job market there is not surprisingly growing very quickly. And all of these things none of these things are expected to slow down anytime soon. And so these are some data that project what the market is likely to do through 2030. And as you can see, the models suggest that things are not going to slow down anytime soon. All right, so with that, I want to mention very quickly, I should have talked about this, I guess, a little bit at the beginning, but this is just the first of 4 events, if you will, that are part of a larger community engagement series that our college is offering this academic year focused on cannabis. We have 3 other events that are coming up this academic year. One of them will be just a little bit later this fall, focused on recreational marijuana. And then we'll have 2 in the spring, one in the early spring, focused more on medicinal uses of marijuana. And then last but not least, as I've hinted at and talked about, there are a large number of us that are involved in research here on campus and elsewhere. And so the last of these 4 events will be focused more on some of the research being done here at UWSP and elsewhere, focused on cannabis and some of the industrial uses of cannabis. With that, thank you so much for being here. I'm happy to entertain questions and chat for a little bit. I also plan on just hanging out for a little while, so if you want to talk with me afterwards, one-on-one or whatever, we can do that. I brought a couple of plants for show and tell. I didn't bring any free samples, but I did bring some plants. And thanks so much for being here, you guys. And I think I have a microphone here. If anybody has questions, I can bring the microphone to you. this thing to cooperate. Thank you very much.
So going back to that, the feral plants, if you were to get caught like with those growing in your property and you had like no idea, could you still get in trouble for that without a license?
It's a great question. I don't know. I mean, I've wondered that. Well, I mean, here's, I guess, I'm guessing most law enforcement have a lot better things to do than to, you know, but I've wondered that myself. I mean, I don't, and the other challenging thing is, I mean, well, as an example, on my way here, I had these plants in my vehicle driving down the road. What if I had been pulled over for speeding or something? Then I've got to try to convince the cop that these aren't marijuana, they're hemp, and here's my grower's license and stuff. But I mean, just, you know, I mean, there's no way to look at that and know that it's not marijuana. You'd have to do, you know, HPLC or something to actually quantify the cannabinoids. So yeah, I don't know, but I've wondered that myself, and I've wondered it like you. Maybe this is why you asked, but we thought about this with feral hemp. You know, because we were asking people to like send us seed from their feral hemp plants that they have growing on there. But we sent out notices statewide to all kinds of different groups, farming groups and stuff. And we did. People sent us seed from all over the place, which was great. But I did wonder. I thought, you know, I wonder how many people out there. They've got feral hemp on their property, but they're not going to send me any. They're thinking, yeah, sure, Mr. Law Enforcement guy, you know, like, you know. So yeah, I wondered how many people out there have seed or just unwilling to send it to us for that reason. So, yeah.
Hello, my name is Nate Sias Porter. I'm an alumni, and I also work here at the university.
Mm-hmm.
Wisconsin's tribal nations are in a very unique position when it comes to the status of marijuana and hemp in the state. And I was wondering if the university has collaborated with local tribes in any way. I think it'd be really cool if certain tribal colleges, like the College of Menominee Nation, if we could collaborate with their students and maybe get them interested in coming into UWSP.
I couldn't agree more. The short answer is no, not really in terms of formal collaborations. I mentioned that we have a new cannabis science program that we started up basically a couple of years ago here. It's a 3-course certificate that students can take. They're taught at the undergraduate level now. And I did have a member of an indigenous group complete that program. She went through and took all 3 courses, and I don't recall all the details off the top of my head, but she actually just reached out to me a few weeks ago because her tribe, I guess, they're growing. They're starting up some sort of and she was reaching out to see whether or not I knew of students who would be interested in working there, et cetera. So I think, I mean, the short answer is I would love to explore those kinds of collaborations, but we don't really have them right now.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Questions at all? Okay, well, like I said, I will hang out for just a little bit. I'm guessing there's still lots of munchies out there that you guys can grab some food. Thanks so much for being here, and we hope to see you at our next event a little bit later this fall.